So, sometimes it's important to take a bit of a leap of faith. Sometimes it's important to go outside your comfort zone. And as a naval historian, my comfort zone tends to be around single-engined aircraft in this particular era. As, believe it or not, most of the aircraft which operate from the carriers have a single engine. Some occasionally have two. They're rarer. Now, when it comes to long-range maritime patrol aircraft, again, quite a lot of them are twin-engined aircraft, and it is worthwhile noting they are definitely my comfort zone. But today's video is about an aircraft which in many ways defined the war in the Mediterranean, more than any other aircraft. And before I go too far on this, I want to recommend you to go and read the actual Italian sources. Just go and look at Italian military archives and all those great Italian historians who are producing some excellent naval history on YouTube. Because the air war in the Mediterranean is one of the most overlooked parts of World War II. In fact, it is chronically overlooked. And that often leads to a lot of the problems and discussions and points out of it. One of the interesting things I often get told by people when we're talking about the Italians is, oh, they just used German aircraft, didn't they? They didn't. They do use the Stuka. They do use some German aircraft. Yes, they do. But they also have a plethora of their own aircraft. And they are not only common, but very capable. And in the air war in the Mediterranean, more often than not, if you had someone attacking you as a ship, it was going to have 3 engines. And it was going to be a Savoia-Marchetti SM.79, sometimes known as the Sparviero. It is an incredibly versatile aircraft. And when I say incredibly versatile, there is a reason why the Italians, the Regia Aeronautica, and other services, but primarily the Regia Aeronautica, acquire so many of them. We're talking over 1,200. Comfortably over 1,200, working their way towards 1,300. Between 1936 and 1945. And they are a feature in pretty much every conflict that happens in that period. Spanish Civil War, Abyssinia, everything that they can be used for, they are used for. They are good aircraft. Whether they're doing high-level bombing, low-level bombing, torpedo strikes, carrying troops and moving personnel and equipment, they are good aircraft. Wherever the Italians go, these go. And that means that for the entire length and breadth of the Mediterranean, you are far more likely to run into these than you are any other aircraft. They are more consistently deployed, more consistently positioned than any other type. So when you are reading books and they mention the air war in the Mediterranean and you think, oh, Stuka, or Ju-88, or any of the other German aircraft, you're sadly not quite correct. And it gets worse because one of the more interesting things you find is the Italians were so often common aircraft that normally they just write in notes, oh, we were attacked by aircraft, we were attacked, because it's normally the Italians. And so you get far more mentions of the Germans because them attacking is rarer. So when the Germans turn up to attack, when Flieger Corps X turns up to attack, it's an occasion because they're the rarer attacks. And then you get a whole generation of documents which come out where if you're looking for exact mentions of specific aircraft, You go through and go, well, they're always talking about the German aircraft specifically. It's one of the joys of history. Sometimes you can get confirmation bias. And sometimes you can get confirmation misleading. And all sorts of other things as well. But let's be honest, those two often come about when you have a plurality of sources which all mention something specifically because they need to, because that's the exception, not the rule. And so when you're looking at the sources, that can look like the rule because that's what they're mentioning. But actually it's the exception. Naval history is fun. And these aircraft are important because they are the air war in the Mediterranean. They're the backbone. Every time you hear there's a major strike, every time there's a major air action, every time there's a major attack on a fleet or formation, it's them. They are there. Yes, there might be Stukas. Yes, there might be Ju-88s. Yes, they might have this technology or that technology. There might even be their own successor, the 84, which is a pretty darn interesting aircraft in its own right. Only 330 or so of those were actually built, though. And they are theoretically the bomber torpedo bomber. And they are theoretically the focused version. They are another triple-engined aircraft, but let's be honest, the 79, that was where it was at. The Sparviero was the cornerstone. It was the reliable. It was the, for want of a better definition and rather suitable for this channel, it was the Regia Aeronautica's swordfish. It was the thing that turned up because the Royal Navy knew it. Royal Navy, or the Regia Aeronautica, depending on whether you're talking about the swordfish or the Sparviero, they might not be sure if it was enough to get the job done, but they knew it would deliver exactly what it was capable of delivering every single time consistently, and its crews had absolute faith in it. And one of the reasons they have the absolute faith in both of these aircraft that they do is because of the development cycle of them. Both of these aircraft went through an incredible amount of development before they enter service. An incredible amount of development after they enter service. So the version you're dealing with is not the version which first came into operation. It's not the version that that was first fielded. No, this is the version which has been tested, which has been thoroughly proven. In the case of the Sparviero, has had a lovely time in the Spanish Civil War doing absolutely terrible things to people. But it allowed them to produce a Mark II variant, which was the backbone of the Regia Aeronautica for the rest of the war. And it was built thanks to the experience of the Spanish Civil War. With that in mind, though, they also account for at least one tribal class destroyer. I realise there is a dispute between the Regia Marina and the Regia Aeronautica over who exactly sank HMS Bedouin, with the Regia Marina suggesting their gunfire was a decisive result. But seeing as someone who has done quite a lot of work on tribals, battles, and daring class destroyers, so has an idea about what he's talking about. HMS Bedouin was limping home when she was hit by an SM-79. She was getting home. And she's not the only one. They are nasty. Their bombs do damage, their torpedoes do damage. Sometimes they sink people. They're good aircraft. And why am I doing a shameless book plug in my videos? Well, as I say in every single one, it's a reminder slide for me to make sure I thank you all for watching the video. Hoping you like, share, and subscribe if you do enjoy the video. and maybe consider doing some stuff on Patreon or Ko-fi or even membership of the channel, because those and super chats and super thanks are how I fund this channel, are how I keep it going, are how I get all the research and buy all the books that I need to support it when I'm in the middle of moving house. And let's be honest, life is fun. So that's all thanks to you. Now, the book's important though, because if I want a permanent post at university, I need to have sold a lot of them. If I want to make a success of an academic career and end up with an academic pension so I can live a comfortable retirement in, let's say, 45, 50 years time, and just make videos and write books as I feel like it, rather than still needing to work pretty much full time to live, I know, that's a dream we're all aiming for. Who knows what the world's going to be like by the time I get there, but we'll keep dreaming for it. I need to have sold a lot of books. So thank you to everyone who's already bought one. Thank you to everyone who might be considering them. They're good, and there are more books to come out soon. So, what do I mean by the mainstay of the Regia Aeronautica? What do I mean by this is the mainstay of the Regia Aeronautica? Pretty much what I'm describing is an aircraft which provided the majority of their bombers, the majority of their strike component, which was a good all-rounder with very good reliability, which was a very sound airframe, where they'd found the big weakness wasn't the airframe in terms of speed, it was the engines, and getting the right engine mix was the critical thing. And also the most numerous aircraft that their forces had to go with, because whilst I'll be talking about the details in the next slide of their characteristics and operation, because I'll be looking at vitals, in this slide, let's talk about why they're the mainstay. In 1939, the Sparvieros were spread across 11 wings, which were partially or fully equipped with the aircraft type. This is following the experience of the Spanish Civil War, following the experience of how much more viable they could make this aircraft, and that's important. And it participated in everything the Italians had done, including the occupation of Albania. By the beginning of World War II, for the Italians, in June 1940, you had a total of 612 aircraft being delivered. It was assigned across 14 wings, the 8th, the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 14th, 15th. Notice a pattern going on here. The 30th, 32nd, 34th, 3rd, 34th, 36th, 44th, 1st, and 46th. Now, not all these wings were entirely SM-79. It's never going to be that way, because some of them, depending on the wing's purpose, will be an entirely SM-79 wing, or they might be a mixed wing. Each squadron would usually consist of 10 airframes assigned, with about 7 to 8 aircraft actually operating. And every wing would be providing about 30 aircraft overall. So you think about that, pretty much what you have is about 40 aircraft assigned to a wing, and they're going to expect 30 of these to be available at any one point. That's the idea. The other airframes being considered second line or maintenance airframes. Now, the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 30th, 32nd, 36th, 41st, and 46th wings, or Stormy, and sometimes the squadrons are actually called Gruppi, were based in Italy, and actually participated also in the Battle of France. And those units alone accounted for 350 out of the 612 aircraft that have been delivered. They're important. When the Regia Aeronautica turns up to hit you, they're turning up with these. To give you an example of this, here is a picture of them. This was not an uncommon sight. for SM-79s to be forming a huge bulk of aircraft ready for operations. And that's where they really become the mainstay, because there's really common airframe, there's really good all-rounder airframe. They can be adapted to a lot of roles, they can be implemented into a lot of missions, and this is where they become truly useful. Because firepower and your capability as a military force often depends upon the scalability of your force. How much of your force can you generate into a usable amount? So the more you have of something, the more likely you are to be able to generate a usable amount of that. These were able to be generated in large numbers, and that meant they were a very usable commodity when it came to the application of force in terms of aviation strength. And part of the reason they were so able to be used to generate this force was because of their design. Their rugged design, their very strong design. So let's consider the vitals behind that design, shall we? Now, vitals is a phraseology I like to use because it works for anything. The vital characteristics, the vital performance, the vital armament, but also because these are the vital statistics of this aircraft. Or ship. Let's be honest, this series did start off with the key ships. So first off, you have a crew of 6, which means you have a pilot, co-pilot, a flight engineer, gunner, radio operator, bombardier, and rear gunner. And the fact is, quite a few of those people can end up manning guns if they need to. There are multiple gunnery positions, and, well, frankly, if anything happens, you have spares to pull the trigger. Length, 16.2 meters. Wingspan, 20.2 meters. Height, 4.1 meters. Wing area, 61.7 meters squared. And it goes on and on. It's an interesting aircraft, it truly is. But as said earlier, the important thing is the engines. And they are 3 Alpha 128R C18 9-cylinder air-cooled radial pistol engines, each delivering 861 horsepower. That's 642 kilowatts for those of you who work in metric, or that particular version of metric. Now, performance, that's 290 miles per hour at 12,430 feet, which is a fairly good speed, but not too dissimilar to the top speed and speed ratios of the Fairey Fulmar, which was the primary fighter the carriers were putting up to defend against it. Range, 2,600 kilometers. That's 1,600 miles or 1,400 nautical miles. Pretty darn good. Pretty darn good. Service ceiling, 24,600 feet or 7,500 meters. That's all lovely, but again, Fairey Fulmar, that has a service ceiling of 27,200 feet or 8,300 meters. And then we have a rate of climb, 5.3 meters a second. Fulmar's 6.1 meters a second. Wing loading, pretty darn good. 34 pounds per square foot, that's decent. That can take a lot of stress, a lot of G-forces. Guns, ammunition, all the bombs they can carry at a good range really does give them some credibility. And this is ultimately the point of this. This is what this aircraft provides. It provides capability. It provides these options. Now, you're probably wondering, Alex, why did you bring up the Fairey Fulmar? Why bring up the Fairey Fulmar and talk that through as well as a comparison point? Well, you see, often when we're talking about the Fairey Fulmar, people bring up the elite aircraft. The aircraft which formed the minority of the strikes. And go, this is what it's got to compete with. And yes, it did have to compete with them. Yes, you do have to factor in the very best aircraft that your enemies can chuck at you. But one of the reasons why the Fulmar does so well in World War II is because those aren't the majority of the aircraft it's going up against. And again, one of the reasons why this aircraft does so well is, again, most of the time it's going up against Fulmars and Hurricanes. And it's a flexible aircraft with a long range that you can mass in large numbers. And those are exactly the sort of things you need if you want to try and saturate a carrier battle group. Especially a carrier battle group which is based around a single carrier. That's one of the reasons why the British in the interwar years had done so much work on developing multi-carrier carrier doctrines and operations, only to find themselves fighting wars where in the Mediterranean it was rare they got two carriers. If you have to look at some of the early operations of Illustrious and Eagle together, before Eagle gets damaged and needs to be repaired prior to Taranto. All sorts of scenarios where the British would like to operate multiple carriers don't take place because of the numbers of carriers available and the sheer geographic spread of the area they have to operate in. But there are times when they do get multiple carriers to operate together. And it's interesting to note that those are the times when truly this aircraft comes into its own as well, because when you have multiple carriers operating together, then your small numbers of high-performance aircraft are great. But they're not going to be able to do the level of saturation, the level of diversion that this aircraft, in its numbers, it can bring to the actual action can do. And that's where it really comes in. It's saturation. Now, its pre-war service is pretty darn cool as well. As said, pre-World War II service includes the Spanish Civil War. It served with... well, so gear is another fun thing for the Spanish Civil War and another proof of why it's so hard often to try and explain the Italian case for the capabilities and their abilities. Because when we talk about the Spanish Civil War, people talk about the Condor Legion and what they get up to. They won't talk so much about the Corpo Truppe Volontarie, which is the Italian ground troops who are sent to assist Franco's forces. And it's even rarer, they'll talk about the Aviazione Legionnaria, or the Legionary Air Force. Aviazione Legionnaria. And I apologise again for mucking up the Italian. This is the trouble, I spent so long learning Latin, I'm very bad when it comes to modern Italian for some reason. Because I keep thinking it's not Latin, it's not Latin, it's not Latin, it's not Latin, it's not Latin. But my mind wants to do Latin, but I know it's not the same as Latin, and that just mucks it up completely. So I apologise. But these forces are completely forgotten, and they have a massive role in the war. They are critical to some of the success that Franco achieves. And frankly, without Mussolini and the support of Italy, Franco would have been in a far, far worse state. They are far more useful than Germany's high-profile but often very small forces. And that kind of lives up the whole way through the Mediterranean War, the whole way through the war in North Africa. We hear about the Africa Corps, not the Italian forces, which outnumber it many times over, and do a very, very good job, and are often some of the tougher fighters which the British are fighting, because they are very, very stalwartly professional. It's unsurprising, we're talking about an Italian army which kept itself together the entire way through World War I against impossible odds and taking impossible losses. That's a very professional force with a very proud heritage that they built upon. And yes, the fascisti government had been present in Italy for a long time, longer than it was in Germany and Spain and anywhere else in the world. But there's also the reality that Italy was the nation of those options which in many ways lost itself the least to the fascists. Let's be honest, would Hitler have tolerated someone turning up in the Reichstag every single day and slagging him off and calling him an idiot or a fat buffoon, or variations upon that. He wouldn't have. There would have been a visit from the SS. Yet there were senators who did that to Mussolini. Fat Boy Fun Boy, the unimproved Second World War edition. Fat Boy Fun Boy, the original, of course, being Henry VIII. We have to give props to Glyn Richardson for that one. An excellent professor of medieval history. And the point is, he never could do anything about it. And that affects things. Yes, there are some political appointees. Yes, there are some officers who are interesting. Yes, the Air Force is sometimes actually more so than any others because it's more new. It's more new, and therefore the fascists have had more ability to influence it. But yeah, the Italian forces are incredibly professional. Now, what do they get up to? That's slightly more interesting in the Spanish Civil War. They were witnesses in 1937 to the bombing of Guernica, which was an operation carried out by the Condor Legion. They were paying attention and seeing what the German aircraft could do. But they'd actually been active in terms of these aircraft, the SM-79, since 1936, the end of 1936. They were deployed mainly to the Balearic Islands and were called the Falci della Balearia, or the Balearic Falcons. They operated over Catalonia and the main cities of eastern Spain. They provided a huge amount of help with that and really did a lot of damage. They killed at least 2,700 civilians and at least it injured many more than 7,000. Over the 3 years of civil conflict, 100 SM-79s were toured through operations, let's say. Only 4 were recorded as being lost in combat. And it's because of this experience, because of the sheer amount of damage they carry out, and the sheer amount of damage they take and survive, that the whole revisions are done, which leads to the SM-79-2, which is the principal version. And that comes into service in October 1939. And the timeline of that being available is a key timeline for Mussolini in, as far as he's concerned, his forces being prepared for war. That's one of the reasons why he waits till he does in 1940. But honestly, it's also one of the reasons why he gives the original figure that he gives to Hitler is into the 1940s. There's a debate. Some say it was 1942, others 1944. The odds are it was probably the latter, because he really did have plans for building up not just the Italian forces, but the infrastructure. And he was doing it in an economically smart way. He was trying to do it in a way which didn't wreck the Italian economy. Not necessarily because he didn't want to, he cared or actually understood why. It was because the opposition he dealt with in his own government. It's always a terrible thing, trying to be a dictator and finding that you cannot dictate to the extent you'd like to dictate. It's terrible. Now, some aircraft, whilst 4 were lost in combat, there are about another 15 which were lost in other ways. Flying accidents, engineering snafus, landing accidents, all sorts of little issues. So again, plenty of experience. In 1937, they had their first interception when they were intercepted and attacked by Polkarov's 16s. If you haven't seen them, they're the Soviet pugnacious fighter that really do look like they've strapped a set of wings, a tail, onto an engine and probably balanced the cockpit on top of it. It's an amazing looking little aircraft, but it really does take the biscuit in terms of pugnacious, I am an engine which has things attached rather than an aircraft approach to design. Thankfully, their quite heavy defensive firepower for their period meant that fighters didn't like to perform close-up attacks on them. And in this original encounter, one of the aircraft was hit by roughly 27 bullets, many of which struck several of its fuel tanks. However, none of them were destroyed. One damaged, none destroyed. Now, what are the really big benefits of this? What are the big changes when you get to the SM-79-2? Well, oxygen masks for high-altitude operation. They decided to fix the relatively high levels of instability, is the phrase that's bandied around in quite a few books. This is often attributed to the vibrations we experience at speeds of over 250 miles per hour, which, if you think about it, if we go back to this lovely slide, kind of important, because if you're limited to 250 miles per hour, that's 40 miles per hour of your top speed gone. And that's you flying a lot slower than a fairy Fulmar. So that matters. There's also other issues which are encountered, solved. The technicians and the engineers and the aircraft maintainers get a lot of real-world experience of keeping these aircraft operational. And again, this builds into ease of maintenance, ease of maintaining operational capabilities becomes a big thing in their fourth generation. There were some interesting events. One of the officers deployed, General Giuseppe Val, who, how do I put this, is a bit of an interesting officer, I have to admit. He's got an interesting career. Anyway, he, at one point, decides that he has to deal with some of the criticisms being leveled at his aircraft. And most of the criticisms were about their night flying capability. So he decided to take off at night and from Guidonia and bomb Barcelona. It was a journey of 6 hours, 15 minutes. And it proved it could carry 800 kilograms of bombs. That's 1,760 pounds of bombs for 620 miles. Did well. As said, they started off from Balearic Islands, and that's why they got the Balearic Falcons, or the Fasci della Balearia designation. But later they moved to mainland Spain, because they can. However, the actual war was not quite always as successful as the Spanish Civil War had been. There is a difference between providing support in a war which is mostly being fought in terms of peer capability, not against an equal. Because let's be honest, whilst the Republican forces often had the greater numbers, the nationalist forces often had the higher tech level, and not too disparate numbers, especially once they got their forces across from North Africa. Well, World War II is different. The Italians do quite well against France. They really do. In fact, they send a lot of aircraft against Marseille, against Corsica, Tunisia, the Alpine Arc, and off to attack French ships. They really do as much effort as they can. But conversely, they also have some bad experiences. For example, Malta. In June 1940, an SM-79 was the first aircraft to be shot down over Malta. It was actually in July, but they start bombing in June, and they keep running into the gladiators, and the gladiators keep causing them trouble. And then, well, eventually, one of them actually crashes into Maltese soil. Some of them had actually been shot down already over the water after being set alight, but in July, the first to fall on Maltese soil. So when they were doing an attempt to bomb the dockyard. But the reality is, they're involved everywhere in 1940-41. Everywhere the Italians are, they are there. In Ethiopia, they're there. During the North African campaign, they're there. They are the critical aircraft that are called upon. They're in Greece, they're in Yugoslavia, they are everywhere. And they do a fairly decent job. Okay, they're not going to get the same headlines as some of the other aircraft will. They're not the sheer speed and lightness of the Mosquito. They're not the image of the Stuka. They are a stalwart, reliable aircraft, a solid airframe with good engines that gives them a reliable turnout and allows them to be used a lot. But what's really interesting is that in 1940-41 that the Italians start trying to use these aircraft as aerosolante, which is torpedo bombers. And they basically established them in August 1940. They start to get used as they develop their skills. And honestly, the Italians do a great development of aerial torpedo attacks and aerial torpedo doctrines, to the extent that we have this. Their maritime strike capabilities are well known and should be well known. We know they sank the former of these destroyers: Fearless, Bedouin, Nestor, Foresight, a sloop, the Ibis, HMS Marigold on a corvette, and HMS... I'm going to look this up in very close detail because I keep pronouncing its name wrong, so I will get it right. HMS Pozarica in 1943, an armed merchant slash anti-aircraft ship. And they damaged HMS Kent. They damaged HMS Liverpool twice, two different occasions. 8th of October 1940, and when she came back again, 14th of June 1942, because that's what you do. They are equal opportunities. They might have served you before, but they will happily serve you again. HMS Glasgow on the 7th of December 1940. HMS Manchester on 23rd of July 1941. HMS Phoebe on 27th of August 1941. HMS Nelson, 23rd of September 1941. HMS Arethusa on the 18th of November 1942. And HMS Indomitable on 16th of July 1943. I find it's kind of interesting because pretty much they alternate between Arethusas and town-class light cruisers. Because Liverpool, Glasgow, Manchester, town class. Phoebe, Arethusa class. Kent is, of course, a county class, but they're a very good illustration of what ships are being used heavily in the Mediterranean at that time, because they're what gets hit by them. And they're also going out, launching bombs, doing all sorts of things they can do to attack the British, the Royal Navy's warships. And this is in addition to the merchant ships they're going after, and they are going after those even more heavily. That's a decent list. And looking at those dates, There's some important operations. You might notice they sort of peter off in 1943. That's not because the breakaway Nazi-inspired separate republic doesn't have an anti-submarine, anti-shipping torpedo unit. It's honestly because they don't get enough of them. They really don't have enough aircraft, and especially not enough of these. They try and focus in on the 84, which is not as good. Realistically, not as good. It's better on paper when you look at the facts and figures, but in actual operational capability, in actual reliable operation, it's not as good. Now, one of the interesting things I often find is that people often market the number of tonnage sunk of ships being sunk, as especially merchant ships, as showing the efficiency on the capability of aircraft and the effectiveness of aircraft. Well, you also have to consider, to an extent, the amount of targets they have. For example, one of the reasons why the Swordfish does as well as it does is because there's a constant stream of coastal convoys going up the coast of Europe and Northern Europe all the way around with German operations. German forces moving around, moving supplies, moving logistics by sea. So they can get the strikes. In 1940, when these aircraft enter service, 2 squadrons make 39 sorties. They carry out 17 attacks, and they damage a little over 30,000 tons of shipping. It's attributed to squadron. 30,000 tons sunk and damaged. 1941, 14 squadrons conducted 225 sorties, made 87 attacks. Sunk 9 ships, 47,700 tons roughly, 48,000 tons, and damaged another 12, on about another 84,000 tons worth of damage. Now, I'd say that's good. That's really good. But you have to put it on the side of what's going on at that point. What kind of aircraft, what kind of movements do you have going on in 1941? In 1942, however, when there's a lot less ships sailing independently, convoys which are sailing tend to be more heavily protected, and a lot of development has been put into air defences and coordination of air power, and a lot of the ideas which started off the war and were the theories and basis have either been proven or disproven, or have been enhanced or worked upon, or the ideas we found they weren't quite right. That's actually what happens to the ideas more often than not. The ideas are found to not be quite right. Not they're wrong, they're not quite right, which can actually sometimes be more difficult to solve. Because if an idea is wrong, you drop it. But if an idea isn't working quite as well as it's supposed to, that's more perplexing because, well, any new idea you have is probably similar to the old idea, so you might as well just fix out the current idea and work out what's wrong with it, and that'll be your new idea. So in 1942, well, the 24 squadrons, made up of roughly 307 aircraft across them all, managed to perform just 60 attacks, and they sunk 10 ships, or 31,000 tons, and damaged 3 more. 32,000 tons, roughly, of merchant shipping. In 1943, now 18 squadrons, it's gone down in number, made a total of 221 combat sorties. And they managed to sink just 3 ships, for a total value of nearly 14,000 tons, and damaged 4 more for a total value of 35,000 tons. In 1944, it just gets worse. It just gets worse, because there's far less aircraft involved. And this is often used as an argument to make the case of them being less effective, declining in capabilities. And I would say it's more a case of your targets are getting fewer, and they're getting a lot harder. So yes, the aircraft is proving less effective, but is it the aircraft is less effective, or the weapon system and ideas behind it? I'd also argue that throughout the war, they have a bit of a hit and miss experience in terms of actually operating with fighters. And that as time goes on, the British air defences get a lot stronger. I would say especially things like the Beaufighter coming out really do limit their ability to do night operations, because the Beaufighters are just causing huge troubles for them at night. And so we get to the summary. Now, I do love the Key Ship series and the Key Aircraft series because they're supposed to be 25 minutes long. If you can remember any of the videos actually being 25 minutes long, please go comment on it so I know. But that's not today's question, and that's not the finish of today's video. These aircraft were used for close support, for reconnaissance, for transport missions, for bomber, torpedo bomber, and all sorts of different roles. And the thing is, yeah, they're not really perfect for any of those duties. They're not. But they're blooming good. And the thing is, it makes me think more as to what the Italians could have done if they'd had longer to prepare. Because they come up with some very good, very efficient ideas. Some very capable and very efficient ideas. And as one historian, Pagliano, wrote, and I am going from a translation here, so I do apologise, because I think they wrote it originally in Italian. It was undoubtedly a very successful airplane, but it cannot be expected that an airplane, no matter how successful, can remain on the scene for 10 years without undergoing any notable modifications. And if at the end of war our units were still operating with that device made of canvas, wood and steel tubes, it means that our crews deserve the monument, but it also means that this is a field the industry had not succeeded to do anything better. Do you know what's scary about that quote about the SM-79? It's that it could stand for so many other aircrafts in World War II. Many of the stalwarts we talk about. And so, yeah, this aircraft is the ultimate 70% solution for World War II. It goes through. And you have to respect the Italians for achieving that. For achieving an aircraft. No, it was not perfect. But it was better than so much else. And it was so useful. That really brings us to a question of, why do you think the Italians get ignored? It's a question I'm often toying with, because I wonder about it, because I see what they do in the reports. Especially once you learn the sort of codes in the archive documents, and you know, hang on, if they're not actually talking about the aircraft, they're just the Italian aircraft, in which case they're usually these. Sometimes they're Stukas, because the Italians had Stukas. That causes fun. Because you'll get people go and look at results of things and go, well, the British claim to have shot down 3 Stukas in this fight, but the German records say none of their aircraft were shot down. Did you check the Regia Aeronautica Stukas? Because they were also involved in it. Why would we check them? Well, the Germans wouldn't keep records of the Italian aircraft shot down. And also, the thing is, if the aircraft come back heavily damaged, you then know who got hit when and which wave they were in. And you can more clearly articulate which aircraft were likely to cause the damage. Because, so again, sometimes it's aircraft is attacking us. It must be German in the history books. Whereas, well, it was probably Italian. I can think of at least one book which claims the damage done to Indomitable was done by a German aircraft. Wasn't. And I'm not going to name names because I do know that author, and they are changing in next edition. They presumed, because they weren't familiar with the archives, they weren't familiar with the documents, and they presumed attacking aircraft must mean they were German, unless otherwise stated in the Mediterranean. And of course that wasn't the case. So yes, why do you think the Italians get such a short shrift when it comes to the history of World War II? And thank you everyone for watching. I hope you consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and if you want to support the channel and support its, it's a continued acquisition of books, even though the sheer volume of books is now ever moving again, please consider Patreon, consider Ko-fi, consider membership and super chats and super thanks, because they really do help. History books, sadly, are not cheap. They should be. I intend on trying to make mine as cheap as I possibly can make them. But I think one of the reasons why they often cost as much as they do is because they are done in such short production runs. Such small runs, and they're orientated around that. And that pushes the price high. And some presses, I swear, do deliberately short runs so they can charge quite so much for them. What do we have next week? We have the conception, operation, conclusion of the Shikoku class. But I also have, and if you've watched this far, a bonus. And please do comment below about getting the Visita bonus, because one interesting conversations I have people just go, well, if they were using the Stukas, they were interested in dive bombers, did they have their own dive bombers? Well, they did work on their own dive bombers. They did have some of their ideas themselves, including this Italian stallion of a dive bomber, the Savoia-Marchetti SM.79, of which only one was built and it was tested by the Germans. But look at it. Look at how... Well, you see, if you don't see the great big greenhouse canopy, it's quite an interesting aircraft. If you don't realise that the pilot lies prone over the back of the engine, because that's supposedly better for G-forces, but incredibly uncomfortable for flying, and makes it very difficult for them to see backwards, because they're lying prone, they're literally lying down like this on their belly, going... Right. Because of course, and when you're doing the dive bombing, the blood all goes to your brain. That's the idea. And the rear gunner sits rearward facing in a normal position. With, I suppose, potentially the pilot's feet near their face, which just adds another joy of interesting design. I'd hope they wouldn't have smelly feet. Okay, yes, it's not the greatest aircraft of World War II, and it's not even the wackiest design of World War II. But this is the point. Italian aircraft, there is very little known about them outside of the people who actually studied the Italians in World War II. And I've been called a pasta boo recently, because I do continually point out that the Regia Marina was a far stronger, far more balanced surface force and fleet, especially at the beginning of World War II, than their German counterpart. That's not being a pasta boo. That's simple mathematics. Go look up the numbers. If you're not sure, go look up numbers of Littorios and other battleships the Italians have in service, the Regia Marina has in service. Go look up the destroyers, the heavy cruisers. Go look up the ships they have in service, and then look at what the Kriegsmarine has. There is a vast, overwhelming difference between the two. And there's a vast, overwhelming difference between the development and the maturity of some of their design works, etc., because they've been able to carry on the work for the previous 20 years. The Treaty of Versailles had undermined so much in Germany that it caused a full stop to so many things. It undermined a lot of what they wanted to do. But the thing is, that doesn't mean the Germans don't produce some good aircraft, but also doesn't mean the Italians don't produce some very interesting aircraft and ships. And today's video has been about the SM-79, which also was probably, I think it was the second largest batch of aircraft sent to the Aviazione Legionnaire. First was the Fiat CR-32 fighters, which were their standard fighters of the period. And again, Italian fighters, they have some very good designs. They don't have the infrastructure industry, because they haven't completed conversion over to them, to build them during the war, because they needed more time. And again, this is the problem with Mussolini and Hitler both being gamblers. They keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and no point does the little voice in the back of the head say, but are you ready yet? Because like all gamblers, they always reckon they can win. Or alternatively, they get a thrill out of losing, because there is a whole spiel of gamblers who actually enjoy losing more than they do winning. But that's a different group psychologically. And we're going to presume Hitler and Mussolini weren't in that particular group of gamblers. Hitler maybe, Mussolini definitely wasn't. They both thought they'd win. I'm going to go with that. They both thought they'd win. They didn't get a thrill from losing. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. And, by the way, only one of these was built as a prototype, sadly. That's all they got. But the sheer number of people and nations who experimented with the idea of the flying prone condition, let alone the flying prone wrapped around the back of an engine. It must have looked so good on paper, but none of them end up in service, so that tells you about the reality of it.